as is always the case, we shouldn't really just discuss the book tonight because we want people to read the book.
Yes.
So I thought we'd talk around the book.
Absolutely. It's a book to talk around.
And I want to do something very specific, but before I introduce the specific thing I'd like to do, I'd like to offer an overly simplistic, highly reductionist theory about the difference between...
Dogs and cats?
No, between you and I.
Oh.
Or is it you and me?
Me.
Me, yes.
Right, me. That would be one of the differences, right?
Yes. Here's the theory, all right? And as I said, don't tell me that it's overly simplistic because I have already told you it's overly simplistic. Right. I start with an idea I'd like to explore. Search for someone to be kind of window dressing, right. Someone appropriate to dress it up, and then pursue it. This is the problem with my writing, of course, because the reader senses halfway through that I've chosen the subject, the person, simply as a convenience to advance this agenda of mine.
I would dispute that, but all right.
You do the opposite. Essentially, all of your writing is about you meet someone, you fall in love with them, and then you come up with some elaborate theory to justify your affection for your character.
I will accept that as a roughly true. I think, though, that there are a lot of people in your stuff, Malcolm, who live on...
We're not discussing me.
But, all right.
You can only discuss your half of this
I certainly think it's generally true, and I will say this, and I will say it with a certain amount of vanity, that I love getting engaged with people, odd people, strange people, interesting people. And John Updike once said, someone said, what's the purpose of life? And he answered instantly, to give praise. And I always thought that was a beautiful...
Well, this is exactly what I was going to say next, which is the other distinctive feature is of your writing is that all of your real pieces, as opposed to your critics' pieces, which I don't mean that they're not real, but I mean all the pieces of journalism
that are not the higher homework, right?
Yes, you always like the subject. The subject, you're never at odds with the subject, and even when you are at odds with the subject, you go to great pains to suggest you're not really at odds with the subject. This happens in this book, by the way, but we'll get there.
Yes, that's interesting you say that, Malcolm. I've never quite conceptualized it that way. I think it's true. The great kind of transformative moment of my life as a writer, my life as a man, as a person, was when I joined The New Yorker in 1986, and I was put to work writing the Talk of the Town. Now, back in those days, Talk of the Town was beautifully anonymous. That was part of the glory of it, because John McPhee would contribute, or John Updike, and then a little schnorrer like me would be thrown into the mix as well. And it was the great epiphany of my life, because up until that moment, I had been a graduate student. I mean, my whole life I'd been a graduate student. I was a graduate student when I was 6 years old, because I come from, like you, I come from an academic family, and that was the way I had been raised. Pursuing a PhD since third grade. And the way you're trained and taught to think and write is argumentative through buts. My sister, Allison, brilliant mind, still works that way, right? Somebody says something and you controvert it. You say, but on the other hand, that's not entirely true. People say that parenting is the most important thing in the world, but in truth, you can't parent at all.
There's a difference between improv and academia.
Yeah,
academia is... yes, and but.
Yes.
Improv is and. Yes, and.
And that's what I realized when I was thrown out onto the streets to go cover table hockey tournaments in Flatbush. A wonderful editor, Chip McGrath, and slack rope walkers lived on houseboats in the Hudson, is that you couldn't argue with these people. You had to illuminate them. You had to caricature them at times. In a positive sense. You had to draw quick portraits of them. But yes, exactly, it was yes, and that the only way to write beautifully, the only way to write descriptively, evocatively, significantly, was to construct small descriptive sentences connected by ands, not long, contentious sentences disrupted by buts. And that moment of moving from one to the other was the great moment in my life.
You were the first person to come to the New Yorker and be forced to dumb it down.
Well, yes, there's a truth in that, but dumb it down only not in ultimate sense, to embrace a form of, if you like, faux naif writing, to embrace a form of minimalism, that wonderful New Yorker tradition that extends from E.B. White and Thurber right into my fingers, at least, if no one else's, and that, with many others, but I mean, I esteem it particularly. And I think that's true. And so for me, that still is the great breakthrough in my life as a writer. And, even when I finally found the voice that that was most my own, and you know how that is. There's that little kind of demon inside you that speaks in your place. It was in Paris, which was the place I loved most in the world, at a moment when we just had a child who, as you know, see, I thought you were going to say the thing in my work is it always ends up being about my children, no matter what I pretend.
Well, you look for the best in your children. It fits.
Yes.
We're getting there.
We'll get there. So yes, I think that's true, and I think it's one of the things that makes the New Yorker tradition remarkable is its insistence, or its implied insistence through a tradition, that the best writing are small descriptive sentences connected by ands.
Before we get to my little game I want to play, I want to add to that. There's a lovely moment in this book when you're talking about Hemingway and Mailer, who are the opposite, who are pugilists, right?
Yes.
And you say
this is a chapter on my learning boxing.
On learning boxing, and you make you assert, I think correctly, I thought it was really interesting that that's the reason why their careers fall off after the age of 40. Mailer doesn't really write anything of consequence after the age of 50, and nor does Hemingway, because you can't sustain that kind of confrontation. But if you approach writing as an exercise in finding what it is to love about your subject, you can write forever. I'm being simplistic, but it is interesting, right, that you didn't have a post-50 fall off.
I hope, well, Charlie, there are people who might, but no, I don't think, I'm in all without
not Mailer level.
No. I say in the book in that section exactly right, because I've been obsessed with learning boxing in the last few years. A wonderful teacher named Joey Contrada, and I go whenever I can. Is that the truth is, Mailer and Hemingway both present boxing as a parallel to writing. It's like writing. Being a writer is like being a boxer. And as I say in there, if that were true, then every boxer would be standing in the ring looking for his spouse or partner, saying, "Did you see the right I threw? Did you see the right I threw? I have an even better one. Hold on. Just watch this one here." And then you'd throw the other one and say, "Which one do you like more? Which one do you think is better?"
About would be 50 rounds.
About would be 50 rounds, because writers are constantly revising, and they're looking for the approval of the person listening. I'm constantly reading out, 4 versions of the same thing.
About would be 50 rounds, and then it would be edited for television down to 3 rounds.
Yes, that's true. But no, I do think it's true. I think if your engagement with writing is fundamentally predicated on Updike's idea that you're there to give praise, I think it's the closest, it's a secularized form of spirituality, I do think. Now, I should say, Malcolm, you're being kind to me, but, I spend significant amounts of time writing
I could only be
criticism.
kind to you if I'm making this argument.
But I spend a significant amount of times, fighting fights with lefties and righties. I wrote that book about in praise of liberalism, but it wasn't praise. You're right, quite right. It was in praise of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor conducting, having clandestine meetings outside the Rhinoceros.
The only way you can be negative is to praise with faint praise.
I can be negative. Yes, that's probably true.